Well, good morning. Pleasure to have you here. Thank you, team, for leading us. Again, I'll just repeat, blessed is the church that allows their young people to come forward and serve. As a church grows, they tend to eliminate that. And so I just want to reinforce that's a very good part of the process of worship. So thank you. So I'll be working out of 2 Samuel chapter 5. Fortunate today, only one chapter. So that is a pleasure. So 2 Samuel chapter 5, which focuses on David's coronation and commencement and parts of his reign. So I have entitled it, Trust and Obey, for there's no other way. I love to watch how the Lord brings various aspects together on a Sunday morning in the song selection and this passage chosen, and it all seems to come together and fit. So it's right from the passage that was read this morning. It's just beautiful to see what the Lord does. So coronation, David's coronation and commencement. So I have faced a few commencements, graduations in my time. And of course, with commencements is a funny word because, of course, we tend to think of it as completion. I've graduated. And no, it doesn't quite mean that. It actually means now begins something new. So commencement means to begin something new. So with commencements, there's usually something that comes afterwards that is fairly difficult and is not easy to get into. And so that will happen with David, of course. So after one of our commencements, after one of our grads, we moved from Saskatchewan to North Carolina. And of course, we moved into a new language. Now, yes, North Carolina does use English, but it is definitely a different English. It's like they've got marbles in their mouth. So you had to listen. And our oldest was in grade 3, and our youngest was in grade 2. And it wasn't long that our second was in grade 2. It wasn't long, and she was coming home and getting up in the morning. You know how it is when children don't want to go to school. They find the most ingenious ways of explaining that to you. And hers was, of course, that I've got a tummy ache. And it didn't take Sharon long to figure out that the tummy ache actually was related to the fact that she could not understand her teacher. And so that, of course, provided some opportunities. Eventually, we're in the South that long that they picked up a fairly good accent themselves and were made fun of when we came up here. So it did grow on her, and she was able to conquer that. So David faces his commencements, and it's interesting, he'll face 3 of them as we move along. Now, the kings of Israel were to keep the Torah, which is the first 5 books of the Old Testament, beside their bed. Well, beside them somewhere. And they were to refer to this or understand these 5 books thoroughly along the way. Now, I'm going to pick on 2 of the chapters out of those 5 books, and so I'm not by that saying that these are the most important, but these 2 actually evidence something that plays out in our text today, and that's why I want to refer to it. So they are Leviticus chapter 26 and Deuteronomy chapter 28. So these were the books that sort of set a course of if you do this, then I will do this. So God lays it out for them. So God really is setting the stage for what it takes to be blessed by God in these passages. Now, I became familiar with Deuteronomy 28. It was a Bible school assignment. We were to sort of get Deuteronomy 28 into our heads, and then we were supposed to pick one minor prophet and underline every quote or inference from Deuteronomy 28 in that minor prophet. I chose Hosea, and I could not get over how much I had underlined. So the prophets, and hear me now on this, the prophets didn't have to have this kind of communication with God as much as this communication with God. If they knew this, they actually could tell what the people needed to hear. So the first 15 verses of Deuteronomy 28 focus on blessing, and then from verse 16 through to verse 65 focus on curses. If you do this, if you obey, I will bless. If you disobey, I will make things difficult for you. And it seems that every 10 verses from verse 16 and following, there's a graduation of difficulty, or maybe I should go this way. So we start out here, this is how hard it's going to be, and then here, and then here, and the time they get to the end, then you're going to be thrown out of the land, a third of you are going to be killed, etc., etc. Like, it just gets from bad to worse. But what is, to me, important to note is the first 15 verses, and I'm not going to read them all, but I would like to at least bring them to your attention. The first one is crucial. Now it shall be, if you will diligently obey the Lord your God, being careful to do all his commandments, which I command you today, the Lord your God will set you high above all the nations of the earth. And all these blessings shall come upon you and overtake you if you will obey the Lord your God. So then he begins to enumerate where they will be blessed. So they'll be blessed in the city. They'll be blessed in the country. You'll be blessed with your children. You'll be blessed with what you work at. And then you will also be blessed in overcoming the enemies that surround you. So if you pay attention to the sequence of what I just read, city, country, offspring, and enemies, that's exactly the route that the author here in 2 Samuel follows. So he has again just referenced back. God said he would do this if you did this, and then he plays out exactly what happened to David. So what we should know from that is that we are blessed by God as we trust and obey. And that follows from Deuteronomy 28 verse 1. If we diligently obey, then God will bless. And Jesus follows that up as well in John by stating that if you abide, dwell, remain, settle, etc. in me, if you abide in me, then you will bear much fruit. So there is a way that God actually steps into our lives and blesses us beyond measure. So then back to 2 Samuel chapter 5 and verses 1 to 5. Then all the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and said, Behold, we are your bone and your flesh. Previously, when Saul was king over us, you are the one who led Israel out and in. And the Lord said to you, You will shepherd my people Israel, and you will be a ruler over Israel. So all the elders of Israel came to the king at Hebron, and King David made a covenant with them before the Lord at Hebron. Then they anointed David king over Israel. David was 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned 40 years. At Hebron he reigned over Judah 7 years and 6 months, and in Jerusalem he reigned 33 years over all Israel and Judah, precise even to the months. So God blessed David in the provision of a crown. blessed by God's provision of a crown. So he had promised David that one day he would rule. So here we see in this passage, David has his anointing as a youth. David has anointing in Hebron over Judah. And then David has an anointing in Hebron over all of Israel. So God steps in. He's anointed 3 times. Now, the elders understood that this prophecy was there, that there was a prophecy about David, that he would reign, and yet they did not step into it right away. They waited. You know, aren't we like that sometimes? We know what the Lord wants us to do, yet we wait, we tarry. But Israel says, you are our bone and flesh. Now, we turn that around, but they want to emphasize kinship here. You are our bone and flesh. You led us under Saul. You led us. You were successful. And you, of course, are to be anointed, or are anointed by God. You are to shepherd and lead us. Now, shepherding in reference to other people has, to this point, only been used of God twice, and then used once of Joshua. So here it's being used of David. So it's infrequently used of humans, but it's specifically attached to David when he is only beginning. That's significant. And secondly, it says that you will be ruler. Again, the author does not use the word king, but uses the word negid, which means to rule, which means to be in front of. So he is supposed to be in front of the people leading, because we tend to think of kings to be sitting on their thrones and not engaged with the people, and that's not the way that God wanted it. Now, Jerusalem, or Old Zion, and they don't really know where that word comes from, but Zion is bounded by 3 deep ravines or valleys. So only the north has to be defended. You could build walls on the other 3. The south point is just more or less a point, but you could build the other 3 points with walls, and you were totally fine. So it was only the north end that really needed a lot of defense. So just think of when Titus comes 1,000 years later with the Roman army. It took a lot of Roman soldiers to get through that northern wall. So David knew it was defensible. And of course, he went up through the water shaft, which bypassed those defenses, and he got into the city. So David is crowned as king. He is blessed by the people. But there's the 3 things that sort of tie him together, and they are kinship, merit, and appointing by God. And if you think of it, Jesus is the same. He's appointed by kinship, merit, without sin, and of course appointed by God. So provision of a crown. So secondly then, blessed by God's provision of a capital, and I got my head of myself here, but blessed by God's provision of a capital, verses 6 to 12. Now the king and his men went to Jerusalem against the Jebusites, the inhabitants of the land, and said to David, "You shall not come in here. The blind and the lame shall turn you away," thinking David cannot enter here. Nevertheless, David captured the stronghold of Zion, and that is the city of David. And David said on that day, "Whoever would strike the Jebusites, let him reach the lame and the blind, who are hated by David's soul, through the water tunnel." Therefore they say, "The blind or the lame shall not come into the house." So David lived in the stronghold and called it the city of David. And David built all around from the Milo and inward. And David became greater and greater, for the Lord of hosts was with him. Then Hiram, king of Tyre, sent messengers to David with cedar trees and carpenters and stonemasons, and they built a house for David. And David realized that the Lord had established him as king over Israel, and that he had exalted his kingdom for the sake of his people, Israel. Blessed by God's provision of a capital city. Jerusalem borders exactly between Judah and Benjamin, really Judah and the northern tribes. So it's a perfect location for the tribes to come together. If you think of it, Hebron would be another 20 miles further south, and it would have been sort of the distance would have been hard for them to come and travel to Hebron. Would have separated the northern tribes more, and so Jerusalem becomes sort of that in-between land for them to come to. It was much like having the Bible school in Sexsmith. It was further to Sexsmith than it was into Grand Prairie, so it was always hard to get people out to them. And you just think of it that way in regards to Israel coming down to Hebron. It would have been difficult to get them there. Now, Joshua does state that when they conquered the land, when they came into the land, they did burn Jerusalem. So it at least there's two possible explanations then for what happened. They did capture it to some extent. There were villages just north of Jerusalem that they may have captured and burned, and never really capturing the Zion citadel, which is the Jewish perspective. Or they captured Jerusalem initially, but let the inhabitants sort of take it over, and that's why the Jebusites were still there. So there's a number of explanations if you've caught that discrepancy in the text. Now, there are hints that God is moving towards Jerusalem in the Old Testament as well. So he is hinting that this is the direction he is going to move. Now, the first hint is, of course, with when Abraham comes back from the slaughter of the 5 kings, he gives a tenth of his spoil to Melchizedek in Jerusalem. And that's intriguing. And the second one is that when Abraham sacrifices Isaac, or goes to sacrifice Isaac, he takes him to Mount Moriah, which is the Temple Mount. So there is already indication in the Old Testament where God is heading on this. So the capital city that God gives him already sort of has its seedbed further back in the Pentateuch itself. Now, in this process, Hiram, the king from Lebanon, takes note of David. So again, here, going back to Deuteronomy 28, city, country is blessed. The country is blessed so much that Hiram takes note of him and, of course, sends building material to David, and David begins constructing. Now, that does take place later, but David is already constructing right from the front end and building his citadel, his city. Now, what's interesting is verse 12, and I'm not sure you caught it, but it is worthy of note. And David realized that the Lord had established him as king over Israel, and that he had exalted his kingdom for the sake of his people Israel. So here again, you see that David understands, I am here for others. This isn't about me. I am here for others. So he is crowned, he is given a city, and then thirdly, verses 13 to 16, meanwhile, David took more concubines and wives from Jerusalem after he came from Hebron, and more sons and daughters were born to David. Now these are the names of those who were born to him in Jerusalem: Shammua, Shobab, Nathan, Solomon, Ibhar, Elishua, Nepheg, Japhia, Elishama, Elida, and Eliphelet. are the sons that are listed here. There's 2 more that will be listed later, and then there are 6 from prior to. So quite a number of sons. So David is blessed by God's provision of children, and that is the 3rd thing that's mentioned in Deuteronomy chapter 28 in the early verses. So as he obeys, David is blessed by these things. So he is blessed by his children. Solomon, interestingly, is 10th in line. So he is not number 1. He is number 10 of the sons. There's quite a list of sons, and somehow Solomon, of course, got David's eye in that sense. Now, in the midst of this section, there is already hints of warning against David, or there is hints of what is to come with David. So we have already seen those hints, and one of them is that David doesn't know how to contend with Joab. So I'm not sure what it is with David and Joab. I realize that they were uncle and nephew. Did that keep David back? I don't see why. I mean, I've had some uncles speak into my life. They had no hesitancy in saying some things to me. So I'm sure we all have had those kind of uncles, right? But maybe it was something else. I don't know. But the second warning comes here when the author says, meanwhile, David took more concubines and wives from Jerusalem. And he puts the word concubines first, not second. And this is the only place in the Bible where concubines comes first. So from my perspective, the author is making a double point here, because Moses said there's 3 things that a king was not to do. So he was not to gather many horses, he was not to gather many wives, and he was not to gather gold and silver. So those are the 3 things that they were not to do. Yet here the author is pointing out that David, and we're going to see this is going to be a further problem, David failed in this area. And yet, you see God still blessing him. And we have to remember that God is looking for obedient people. And David was obedient in a large extent. And and I think it is also good for us to know that God is looking for obedient people, not perfect people. Because there is no such thing as a perfect person. And that is comforting for us. So blessed with a crown, blessed with a capital city, blessed with children, and then lastly, the enemies. War with the Philistines, 17 to 25. I'll read a few of the verses. When the Philistines heard they had appointed David king over Israel, all the Philistines went up to seek out David. And when David heard of it, he went down to the stronghold. Now the Philistines came and spread themselves out in the valley of Rephaim. Then David inquired of the Lord, saying, shall I go up against the Philistines? Wilt thou give them into my hand? And the Lord said to David, go, for I will surely give the Philistines into your hand. So David came to Baal-perazim and defeated them there and said, the Lord has broken through my enemies before me like the breakthrough of waters. Therefore he named that place Baal-perazim, Lord of the breakthrough. And they abandoned their idols there, so David and his men carried them away. So he provided David with provision to conquer his enemies. So his growing prominence didn't escape the notice of the Philistines who were to the west. Now, if you remember, 7 years in Hebron, they somewhat ignored him there, but when David pulled the 12 tribes together, all of a sudden they were a collective menace. Now the Philistines had to do something. They had to step in. And if you have your geography in your head, Jerusalem, though it isn't in the center, is more towards the north. And what the Philistines were going to do was go right into that corridor and separate Judah to the south and the 10 tribes to the north. By doing that, they could split them and therefore keep their power base manageable. And that's what the Philistines were after. So when it says that David was in his stronghold, it isn't Jerusalem, but it is to the west of Jerusalem. And that's where he was residing when he asked the Lord, what shall I do? And again, you'll notice that David asks twice, both situations, what am I to do? And of course, God directs him differently in each case. You will do this with the Philistines this time, and you will do that next time. So he inquires of the Lord, even though he has a very good idea of what to do. And David, of course, gives the battle to the Lord. He attributes the battle to the Lord and says, God is the one who gave me the breakthrough. So the Lord of the breakthrough. It's used of, a torrent that rushes out, perazim, to rush out and break through. And that's what happened with the Philistines. Now, this passage states that they collected the idols and doesn't say anything more. But Deuteronomy says that when you collect the idols, you are supposed to burn them and destroy them so there's nothing left of them. And if you read in 1 Chronicles, then it notes that David did exactly that they collected them and they burnt them. So the author here is simply assuming that that's understood. David is going to follow through on what he is supposed to do. So David inquires of the Lord and, of course, follows through. He does as the Lord instructs. He follows his Father's will. And if that's not sounding familiar, let me remind you that Jesus in John 17 does exactly that. He says, Heavenly Father, I have glorified you here on earth. I have followed what you have wanted me to do. And so here David begins to present a picture of what the Messiah will be like. He foreshadows the Messiah in doing the Father's will. So in conclusion, David sees God as king. David sees God as king. In every way, he is letting God to be king. And in that, then, he has learned to trust and obey. Even if the other force is superior, I will trust in you and I will obey. So what's our attitude like towards God? How do we see God? Do we inquire of God and ask, what shall we do? Do we inquire and ask, Lord, lead me in the way I shall go? David sought to please God. So are we seeking first to please God in our life? Or is self still coming through? Is self still leading the way? Let's continue to identify what is holding us back. See, God's leading is superior to our own, but we need to figure out what really we're trusting in, what we're depending upon. Because until we do that, we won't really trust in God. If we can't see what we're trusting in, then we can talk all day about learning to trust God. But our knee-jerk reaction to stress in our life will be to do the same old thing. We'll head straight back to the fridge rather than going and trusting God. The journey will be slow. I did not find this journey easy because my mind still wants to turn back to the ways I learned as a child. But it sure is getting a lot easier to see God today. Becoming consistent in our lives is the process of learning to please the Lord. Becoming consistent, diligently learning to obey God. So let's trust and obey, for there's no other way to be happy in Jesus but to trust and obey.